Great invasive species and volunteer management seems intimidating, but with planning and intention, you can do it. In this video, part 1, we will cover how to approach working with a natural resource professional and having meaningful impact on the environment.
Part 2 is about how to recruit and engage volunteers, so don't miss that video.
When managing natural resources, it's really important to know where exactly you're going to manage. So you might have a park in mind, for example, but it's unlikely you're going to really manage the whole park or help someone else manage the whole park. So you're going to need to define a sublocation, an area that's reasonable that you can concentrate on. Once you've made that decision, you're going to need to look for documentation. Are there already plans for that area or the park? Are there maps or photos that might be helpful? And in order to do that, you're going to need to reach out to the natural resource professional. Pretty much every large area of land, particularly those that are publicly owned or managed, have a natural resource professional designated to them. Working with that professional is going to be critical to getting long-term sustainable management on the landscape.
Some people have done this a bunch. Do they really need to work with a natural resource professional?
Yeah, volunteers might have tons of experience and be really competent, but if you don't know the larger plan for that area, if you don't know what has already been done on that site or what is planned to be done on that site, you may not make it better with your volunteer activities. So for example, maybe they are planning to do a burn this spring and you don't know. Maybe they've pre-seeded and you're unaware. You just need to make sure that whatever activity you do or you lead volunteers to do is complementary and helpful for the overall and long-term plan. After you've worked with your natural resource professional and you have a plan for the site, it's time to think about your actual invasive species project. In order to do that, I recommend you use the Invasive Species Project Planner, which is linked in the description to this video. You need to be sure you're clear about the long-term plan for this site. So are you going to need to manage invasive species over years and over seasons? And is that something you're willing to take on, or you're working with your natural resource professionals? Because it's important to think ahead and plan ahead for these activities. You might have to start planning in the summer for a spring activity and in the spring for a fall activity.
How do people know what work to do in what season?
Right, so you're going to work with your natural resource professionals and you're going to make sure that you're all on the same page, because sometimes herbicide applications in the spring aren't ideal, but you don't want your plant to go to seed by late summer or early summer. So you're going to have to work really closely and really be up to date on that with your natural resource professional. Then you're going to need to decide, are the activities that need to be done to get rid of that invasive species reasonable to do for volunteers? So many are not, so you're not likely to have volunteers wielding a chainsaw or starting to prescribe burn, but you might have volunteers do hand removals or chemical applications depending upon what's allowable at the site. You're going to need to define that clearly and make sure that's appropriate for the site and the invasive species that you're trying to manage.
Okay, I know some people really prefer to avoid chemical use in the environment.
Yeah, I was waiting for that. So a lot of people are really anxious about using chemicals in the environment, and I understand that. But I think it's also really important to remember they may be the best tool for that action. And some examples are, so if you're working on a park that has Native American cultural resources on it or Native American burial sites, it may not be allowable to disturb the soil. So you cannot hand pull, you cannot weed wrench. So you may have to use chemicals. Another good example of when they can be really critical are on steep slopes. So if you're working on an area with really steep slopes and you hand pull or you use a reed wrench or some other tools to do that, you may indeed cause erosion afterwards, and that can be even more detrimental to the site than either leaving the invasive species or using targeted chemicals in order to kill them. So it's something you need to think about. You need to be really clear if it's appropriate for the volunteer, if it's allowable on the site, and if it's the tool that is going to solve the problem here, but I do think you need to consider it as one of your options. Disposal can be a major issue, so you need to think about that early and often. So part of the problem is you often need to get rid of the propagating parts, and maybe that's the berries, maybe it's the whole plant, it could be any number of things, but you have to think about it early and you have to plan at a local level.
I've heard that sometimes problems with disposal halts the whhole project because people don't know where to get rid of the stuff they've removed.
Yeah, if you end up at the end of your project with a ton of garbage bags full of something that you're invasive species and you have no plan to get rid of them, you're not making people happy.
One thing I've seen too is where a project assigns volunteers to just remove those propagating parts, maybe the berries or the reproductive part of the plant. And maybe that's a task that's easier for perhaps a lower mobility volunteer. Just snip off the berries, dispose of those berries. You've gotten rid of the most dangerous part of that invasive species and reduced your total volume of waste. So that makes it easier to get rid of.
Ecological restoration is the next step. Once you've gotten rid of the invasive species, you need to make sure that the environment is in place for new things to grow or propagate. Part of that is prevention of additional invasive species. So there's all kinds of ways you can look at prevention: boot brush stands, better education, outreach, regular annual surveys, but that needs to be a part of what your thinking process is as you move forward in this.
Some invasive species keep regrowing despite your efforts. So how long do we expect to keep working on an individual species before it's truly gone?
Yeah, it's species specific. Some species, they have, a seed bank life of maybe 3 years, others it's 7. It's species dependent. But I think doing an annual survey is just good practice generally.
We're going to put in a point for a suspected Oriental bittersweet site. I can take a picture of the site so that the land manager can be certain that we're in the exact place when they come to look.
So if you think you've gotten your site down to really almost no invasive species of any type, then I think it's really reasonable to either yourself or have volunteers, or make sure your natural resource manager includes this in their work plan, to annually or a couple of times a year go out and do an invasive species or any kind of natural resource survey. But a survey that goes out and intentionally looks for those new invasive species popping up, or the regeneration from the seed bank, or any of those types of things.
But because of that, it's reasonable to expect that any invasive species removal effort's gonna take a couple years to make sure you truly got it all.
A couple years at least. Yeah, you can think of this as a long-term project.
It's a commitment.
It's a commitment. Finally, if we've overwhelmed you with this video, you're maybe not alone. So I would recommend that you go out and you shadow someone. And it might be great to shadow that natural resource professional that you're building a relationship with. See if you can go out on a day that they're pulling that invasive, or they're cutting that invasive, or they're managing volunteers. So you can see how they do that. You can kind of get your feet wet, understand how it happens, and then you can try it on your own. I'm delighted to report that the reward I hear about from volunteers who have done this before is when they go out to a site and they see those spring ephemerals, they see the native flowers popping up, they see tree generation, they see the prairie in bloom without the invasive species. It's super energizing to know that you've made that kind of impact on the landscape. And you can just see how dense that understory is. And if you look to the other side, you can see where they have been working on it. And that is much more open. You can actually see there's some understory coming up, but you can see the cut stumps down there. And this is what a forest should look like with really good sightlines. You should be able to see the trees.
Up next, part 2, how to best work with volunteers on your invasive species project.
Okay, so we're gonna pull this out so you can see the orange bark at the bottom.